Thanks for joining us and welcome to this webinar series where we're seeking to explore advances in environmental assessment. I'm Josh Fothergill, founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting and a highly experienced trainer across various environmental assessment areas. I'm the host and facilitator of this webcast series, and what we're looking at today is session 3 of a mini-series focusing on the Office for Environmental Protection's 2023 review of England's environmental assessment regime. This episode, as you can see on the slide, is going to focus on post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting. However, if you haven't already, I'd recommend that you catch up, particularly with episode 1, which set out the purpose, the research and the overview recommendations. That'll give you a really good context for this deeper dive as we're going into episode 3, but also episode 2 on data availability and episode 4, which is still to come on skills and expertise, provide deeper dives as well. I should note we're recording this in early January 2024, so it's before the government has formally responded to the OEP's report, so we don't have the insights that will come from that response. I should also note that all the recordings from the series can be found on Fothergill TC's YouTube channel and on fothergilltc.com, and the report itself and the link to it will be up when we go to the Q&A session at the end of this episode. So all that leaves me to do is introduce this session on post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting. It's going to be delivered by Emma Hawthorne, who is Principal Scrutinising Environmental Law and Advice Manager at the Office for Environmental Protection. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Josh, and hello, everybody. I'm going to be talking through our report and our specific theme of post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting. So in this episode, I'm going to go through our findings and recommendations to government, and then, as Josh has said, answer some questions that have come through at the end. So episode 1, which was presented by Elaine, that was an introduction to our report. So I'm just going to do a quick recap here. And as Josh has said, we recommend that you go back and have a look at episode 1 to get more detail on that. So we undertook this work under our function to monitor the implementation of environmental law. So this looks at how the law works in practice. We looked at EIA, SEA and HRA. We undertook this work in the context of changes put forward by government to these assessment regimes. So that was the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act for EIA and SEA, and the Nature Recovery Green Paper in relation to HRA. So reform should be grounded in clear-sighted understanding of the root causes of the underlying problems with the current regimes, and we want our report to influence government. So our work took approximately 1 year and it included significant stakeholder engagement. We also commissioned 3 pieces of external research, and those reports there that are on that slide, they're available on our website. Our overall findings were that the issues were not about the legislation, so that's not to say that the legislation is perfect, and some areas for improvement were identified. However, the key issues arise from how the regimes are implemented. And we identified 3 fundamental root causes, which was access to information, the extent of post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting, and the topic of this episode, and then access to expertise. And these are deep-seated issues that are not susceptible to easy fixes. But unless these issues are addressed, reforms to environmental assessment legislation are unlikely to deliver government's ambitions, and indeed new legislation might create new problems. So moving on to our findings for this topic. So the issues we identified were that while significant time and effort is spent gathering and analysing evidence for environmental assessment, sometimes several years, post-decision limited time is spent monitoring, evaluating and reporting. So that's firstly to determine whether the predictions made in the environmental assessment were accurate, and in our report we call this validation monitoring. And secondly, whether the mitigation or compensatory measures are offsetting impacts as required. And in our report, we call this effectiveness monitoring. And we found that effectiveness monitoring does occur more frequently than validation monitoring, but the key issue here is around evaluation and reporting. So that is that the results from this type of monitoring are not widely shared with others to learn from. So why does this matter? Mitigation measures are often relied upon in environmental assessments to enable a proposal to go ahead. So with HRA, plans and projects may also progress to the compensation stage, although this occurs much less frequently. And these mitigation and compensatory measures are of little or no value unless they are successfully implemented. And this relies upon monitoring and evaluation, which may then identify the need for remedial action. So without these two types of monitoring, there's a high risk that environmental assessments are not accurately predicting and then offsetting the impact of proposals on the environment. And that's during construction, operation, and where relevant, during decommissioning. And we found these issues with post-decision monitoring exist because there's a shortage of expertise, and this is a well-known issue in public bodies, and Elaine will talk more about this in episode 4. But in relation to monitoring, we found that a lack of expertise leads to unclear monitoring requirements and subsequently difficulty evaluating results and resolving issues. Monitoring is only valuable if it has a clear purpose, so for example, to determine whether a required mitigation measure is offsetting impacts as predicted. And this relies on the skills and resources of decision makers responsible for imposing conditions and for the public bodies responsible for receiving and evaluating the monitoring information. Secondly, costs. So post-decision monitoring can be a long-term endeavour, and this barrier concerns costs to proponents who undertake and pay for the monitoring and the public authorities who should oversee the monitoring and evaluate its outputs. Again, it's a recognised issue that there's a lack of resource in the planning system, and if public authorities lack the skills and resources to review and act upon the results of any post-decision monitoring, proponents may be unwilling to invest in costly post-decision monitoring programmes. And lastly, a lack of enforcement. So our research found that enforcement of planning conditions rarely occurs. And this means that proponents have less incentive to comply with monitoring requirements, and implementation then relies upon the governance mechanisms and integrity of the proponents. So the consequences of these issues, firstly, as I touched on in episode 2, once baseline environmental information has been gathered, much of environmental assessment relies upon predictions. That's to predict the impact of the proposal on the environment and to predict how that impact may or may not change with the application of avoidance or mitigation measures. And there's evidence to show that environmental assessments are more certain in their predictions than they should be. In particular, impacts that were later found to be significant were predicted inaccurately in the environmental assessment. And this means that environmental harm may not be offset as expected or as required under the permission granted. And the second consequence of a lack of post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting means that the opportunity to improve future practice by learning from experience is lost. As we highlight in our report, as well as environmental consequences, this leads to time and resource consequences with proponents and public authorities reinventing the wheel time and time again. So now moving on to our recommendations in relation to monitoring. Recommendation 4, the purpose of this recommendation is to ensure that the key stages of evaluation and reporting are undertaken when required, and that this information is publicly available for others to learn from and use. Regular reporting to government should ensure that action is taken where evaluation and reporting demonstrates the need. Government guidance should improve the consistency and quality of planning obligations, ensuring that purposeful monitoring is undertaken by proponents. It's important that the different types of monitoring are understood, and it's clear when each type of monitoring should be secured. And this is particularly the case for validation monitoring, which is used to inform future assessments. This means it can be difficult for decision makers to determine that this type of monitoring is necessary and therefore satisfies the legal requirements for planning obligations. Government's guidance should clarify that point. Recommendation 6 will provide independent oversight of environmental impacts during construction and operation, and this would resolve the issues we identified with self-reporting. So we're aware that IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and the Association of Environmental Clerks of Work are currently working on proposals for ecological clerks of work and environmental clerks of works, and these could deliver this recommendation. There's still a role for government in considering when this independent oversight is required and how government could ensure it's implemented in these cases. Our last recommendation in this chapter is specific to compensatory measures under the Habitats regulations. So these measures are required when a plan or project is given permission to go ahead, despite the environmental assessment being unable to conclude that there'll be no adverse effect on the integrity of a protected site. And concerningly, we found that whilst the Secretary of State has a duty to ensure that the coherence of the national site network is protected, there appears to be no process in place to determine whether compensatory measures met their objectives and are continuing to do so. In fact, in one recent report written by several of DEFRA's arm's length bodies, it states that some compensatory measures appear to have failed their objectives to maintain the coherence of the network, but it is unclear what, if any, follow-up has been taken to remedy this. So this recommendation requires government to regularly assess and report on the success of compensatory measures, and it also includes a requirement for government to include the evidence base it relied upon and seek advice from independent bodies with relevant expertise. So that is the end of the presentation, and I shall hand back to Josh for some questions that we've received.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that. Very useful run through of the post-consent and monitoring side of things within the report. Yeah, worrying the HABSREG side of things. Certainly the rest of it had a lot of resonance from my experience of EIA and SEA. And certainly there was much hope back in the early 2000s that the bringing in of SEA would enable this kind of tiering of data sharing and monitoring and that type of thing. And whilst the regulations provide the context for it, it hasn't really come out of practice. So I guess that, further expounds, kind of what your report highlights, that legislation isn't necessarily going to be able to fix these things. It's more of an implementation side of things. We have had a couple of questions come in. We of course aren't live, but we have been able to get some audience participation and questions through some LinkedIn discussion, and also the OEP launched this report back in October 2023, so a couple of months ago now, and I've been having some discussions at face-to-face rollout events and conferences. So we brought in some of that discussion today. And just to highlight, alongside our speaker Emma, we also have her colleague Elaine Webb, principal lawyer, kind of present on the call. She is the speaker in session 1 and session 4, so do catch those and the Q&As in relation to those. So moving on to the questions, Emma, in relation to, I guess, kind of the monitoring side of things, it's all a little bit afterwards, so is there a risk, does the report kind of overstate the benefits of follow-up and audit, given that this is only going to occur either during construction or sometimes not even until operation? And by that point, the environmental assets might already have been damaged, degraded, or lost. So is there a risk that your report's overstating this potential benefit?
Okay, so thank you for this question. And as we set out in our report, we do recognise the importance of the mitigation hierarchy. We refer to that a couple of times in our report. And obviously, it's important if impacts could be avoided, that happens sort of first off, if you like. However, many proposals do move past that avoid impact stage fairly quickly. And post-decision monitoring was a key issue that was raised by stakeholders. So, for example, in the WSP work, they undertook a practitioner questionnaire, and better post-consent monitoring was the top improvement that was identified by practitioners for both EIA and HRA. And it was also evident in the evidence that we reviewed, and this is why it led us to have this as one of our 3 topics in our report. That's because we agree that it is a key issue. Much of environmental assessment is about prediction, and research has shown that those predictions are not often accurate, and that's why that post-decision validation monitoring is really important, and that's how the environmental assessment process improves. And then in relation to the other type of monitoring, evaluation monitoring, very often proposals are given permission based on mitigation, or as I outlined, in some cases, compensation. And if there's no or limited monitoring, evaluation and reporting, then there's quite a high risk of environmental harm if issues aren't identified and remedied. So as I mentioned in terms of recommendation 7, that's a particular concern for protected sites.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I guess I know obviously your report was focused on England, but certainly in Scotland they found some challenges with various sectors kind of moving forward and perhaps not feeling that they were being viewed on site. So the consent was on paper, but what was actually delivered in practice, and certainly quite a lot of that environmental or ecological clerk of work seems to be gaining quite a bit of momentum from the Scottish side. So interesting to see you note that. Moving on to one of the other areas, perhaps more in relation to the enforcement side of things. So in your view, or well, I should say the OEP's view, of course, is that issue of a lack of effective enforcement by planning authorities, is that purely down to limited skills and resources, or did you find that there were some other factors that came into play in relation to that?
Well, our research did point to the lack of skills and resources. So that's not to say that there's other issues, but these weren't identified in the research that we did or by the stakeholders that we spoke to. So in our report, we refer to very recent work that was undertaken by the RTPI, the Royal Town Planning Institute, and they found that 80% of respondents to its survey on enforcement reported that they had insufficient staff to carry out workloads. And as we found in other cases, enforcement actions therefore rather reactive, and it relies on third-party complaints.
Thank you. That's quite eye-opening research. It's notable as well. I think it's only the planning EIA regs that actually have the extra bit of wording in for EIA that talks about this kind of reporting back, and that I think that's one of the challenges for the for the processes. You know, the assessment kind of stops, it hands over to the consent, and it's keeping that kind of, I suppose, handing on that environmental responsibility and making sure it's carried forward.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that brings me to the end of the questions that we've had in relation to post-consent monitoring and this area. So thank you very much for that. So really that brings us to the end of this episode 3 of 4. So thank you for listening as the audience. Thank you very much to our presenter, Emma Hawthorne, and also to Elaine Webb, who is the presenter in episode 1 and episode 4, which hopefully you will join us for. I've been Josh Fothergill, the facilitator of the session from Fothergill Training and Consulting. You'll find the recording of this session and the other episodes on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can find the OEP's report and those 3 evidence documents that back it up on the web link that was on the previous slide. So that is all from this episode 3, and I hope you join us for the other episodes.